The signal came at 4:47 in the morning, and my first thought was not about my daughter. My first thought was that the coffee had gone cold again, and that the mug had a chip on the rim I kept meaning to file down, and that the blue light from my monitors was doing something cruel to my eyes that 3 years of night shifts had not made easier. The monitors showed the deep array feed from Cygnus X1, which is a black hole cluster 4,000 light-years from a planet where my daughter has been dead for 19 months. Then I heard her voice. 3 words. Do not open. I sat with the chipped mug in my hand and the coffee going colder, and the blue light doing its thing to my eyes, and I did not move for a very long time. Her name was Yara. She had her father's jaw, and my stubbornness, and a laugh that sounded like she was always about to deliver the punchline of a joke you had not heard yet. She used to sit on the kitchen counter while I cooked and talk about orbital mechanics the way other teenagers talked about music. She made flashcards for every exam, and then lost the flashcards and passed anyway. She drove too fast on empty roads, and drove precisely the speed limit in cities, and said this was not a contradiction, it was situational awareness. She went out on the Persephone research vessel at 24 years old, as a junior signals officer, which was the job she had wanted since she was 9, and made me show her the dish arrays on the roof of my university building, standing up there in the cold Cologne winter, with her mittens on, and her neck craned back, and her mouth open at the sky, like the sky owed her something, and she was ready to collect. The Persephone went dark 19 months ago. All hands. 1 probe came back, transmitting 4 seconds of data before the heat of re-entry dissolved it into expensive scrap. I had those 4 seconds memorized, not analyzed, memorized. The way people memorize the last words someone they loved said to them before a door closed. They lived in my chest somewhere below language, in the place where things go when you cannot look at them directly, but also cannot put them down. The deep array station I ran from my apartment in Cologne was supposed to be monitoring spectral emissions from the Cygnus cluster. That is what the grant committee believed. That is what the annual review report said, with all the right charts in all the right colors, and the language that meant what it needed to mean for the people reading it. The station cost the European Space Agency a number I was not allowed to repeat in polite company, and for 19 months I had been fighting to keep it funded through a series of bureaucratic encounters that I was winning through sheer refusal to lose, which is not a technique they teach in any academic program I am aware of, but which I had developed through practice into something I was proud of, in a way I could not fully explain. 3 weeks before the signal, I sat on a video call with a man named Hollenbeck, who ran the Budget Review Committee, and had the pale, particular look of someone who had never been wrong about anything, because he had never tried anything genuinely difficult. He had 8 other faces on the grid with him. I had my kitchen in the background, and yesterday's jacket, and the specific energy of a woman who had not slept properly since a date she could tell you to the exact hour. I gave them the pitch. I am good at pitches. I know how to make data sound like a story, and I know when to slow down and when to go hard, and I know that committees like Hollenbeck's are not afraid of numbers. They are afraid of being the person who killed something important. I know the shape of that fear, and I know how to press it carefully, so it moves in the right direction, without being dishonest about the facts. I gave them 11 minutes of reasons why the station mattered, why the Cygnus cluster's emission patterns were yielding data that no other existing array could replicate, why shutting it down now would mean losing 3 years of baseline measurements that could never be recovered, and I watched the faces on the grid, and at minute 9 I could see that I had won. At minute 11, Hollenbeck said they would keep the funding for another review cycle. I said thank you in the tone that means I will see you here again in 6 months, and I closed the laptop. I ate cold rice standing at the counter. The window above the sink showed me the specific orange of Cologne streetlights against low December clouds at midnight. I ate the rice and looked at the orange light, and did not think about why I really kept the station running, because I had an agreement with myself about that, and the agreement was working, and I was not going to be the one to break it. The agreement was simple. I did not say certain things out loud. I did not use certain words. The specific word that would mean I had not accepted what the mission report said about the Persephone, what the physics said about objects and event horizons, and the mathematics of trajectories from which there was no return. What every expert I could not stop reading said, with the specific precision of people being as gentle as their discipline would allow. I did not say those words to myself, and I did not say them to anyone else, including Darnell. My ex-husband taught chemistry at a high school in Austin and called me every Sunday at 11 in the morning, his time, with the steady patience of a man who understood what I needed the calls to be, which was about ordinary things. Austin weather, his students and the school productions they put on, and the things they said in class that caught him off guard. His neighbor's dog, which had been getting into something different every week for 3 years, and showed no signs of reform. He knew. He never said it either. We had both made the agreement separately, and we kept it the way you keep something fragile, which is carefully, with both hands, without drawing attention to your own hands. And then, at 4:47 in the morning, on a Tuesday in December, the signal came. I played it 8 times before I did anything else. I ran the voice print against Yara's archived mission logs, which I was not supposed to have copies of and had anyway, and which I had maintained and backed up on 3 separate drives for 19 months without consciously deciding to. 99.7% match. The 0.3 I filed in the part of my mind reserved for things I would deal with later, which was a part that had become substantial over the last few years. I did not call anyone. I sat at the desk as the sky outside went from black to gray to the pale, grudging light of a Cologne winter morning making no promises, and I opened every analysis tool I had, and I started working, because working was the thing I knew how to do, when everything else stopped being accessible. Under the audio there was a carrier wave, a data packet, compressed in an encoding that I had never encountered, that none of the standard tools I had could crack without significant modification. I modified 3 different analysis frameworks over the following 48 hours. I ate from whatever was in the refrigerator without heating it. I messaged Tomas, my doctoral student, twice, with brief replies about his spectral work that said nothing about what I was actually doing, and which were technically true, in the way that most things I said to keep the grant committee happy were technically true. Day 3, 2 in the morning, under a sky that had committed to winter without reservation, the encoding cracked. Inside the packet was a map. Not of space in the way I had spent 30 years mapping space. Not stars or coordinates or the beautiful cold geometry of distance and mass and deep time. This map showed movement. One object, moving through the outer reaches of our solar system in a way that objects were not supposed to move, with the specific pattern of something that was choosing its path the way water chose around stone, except water did not choose. This did. It was moving around our detection hardware, around the arrays and satellites and relay stations and every piece of equipment that human civilization had placed in the dark over the last century of spacefaring effort, moving around them in the pattern of something that knew where they were, had taken the time to learn, and had decided that not being seen was preferable to announcing itself. It was heading toward the inner system, toward the warm part. I put both hands flat on the desk and felt the wood under them, and stayed very still for a moment that was not as long as it felt. Then I called Darnell. It was 3 in the morning in Cologne, 9 in the evening in Austin, and he picked up on the second ring because he always picked up when I called outside normal hours. He has done this for 25 years. It began when Yara was born, and we were both learning what it meant to have someone outside yourself that you would answer the phone for at any hour. I meant to tell him. I had the words. I had been constructing them during the long hours of waiting for the encoding to crack, in the gaps between running processes and staring at the wall and eating cold food without tasting it. What came out of my mouth was a question about the Austin weather. He told me, warm for the season, his neighbor's pecans coming in early. The dog had gotten into something again, which did not surprise either of us. I said that was good. I hung up. I sat completely still for a moment. Then I was in the shower some hours later, and the water had gone cold because I was sitting on the tile floor, and the pale winter light through the frosted glass was doing something unhelpful, and I did not know precisely when I had gotten there, or how long I had been sitting, and the tiles were cold under my hands. I got up. I dried off. I went back to the desk, and the map was still there, and the moving thing was still on it, and Tomas's timer, which he had built for a different purpose, and which I had repurposed without telling him, was counting down from the date the Persephone went dark. 17 months. Maybe less. 2 months they had already been here, watching, learning the shape of what we put in the sky, and the gaps between what we watched and the rhythms of what we paid attention to and what we missed. I had a phone number. I had gotten it at a conference in Geneva 3 years ago. from a woman in a gray blazer with the careful, observing eyes of someone professionally paid to notice what other people were trained to overlook. She had pressed her card into my hand at the end of a panel on deep field anomalous readings, and said something low and precise about how certain categories of observation sometimes needed a different kind of follow-up than standard academic channels provided. The card had a number and a name, and the name implied an institutional structure that I had not wanted to interact with for reasons that were entirely personal. I looked at the number. The drawer in which I kept it had been closed for 19 months because of the agreement. Because using the number meant saying out loud the word I had not been saying, the word about what I was and was not accepting, and I was not ready. I picked up the phone. 2 rings. A woman's voice. Sharp. Fully awake at 4 a.m. Cologne time. 1 word for a greeting, and the word was not a greeting. It was an assessment. I said, "I need to talk to someone about my daughter." A pause. Not long. The pause of someone who has kept a file open for a long time, and is now looking at it. She said, "We have been waiting for you to call, Dr. Vasquez." The cold thing in my chest, the one I had not been naming, moved. It found a new position. Something settling into the shape that had always been prepared for it, like a key going into a lock it was made for. I had been angry for a very long time, not loud angry, the other kind. The cold kind that does not go away, that sits in the center of you, and becomes part of the infrastructure of your days, until you forget, it was not always there. I finally had somewhere to point it. I said, "I am on my way." The facility did not have a name on any door. It occupied a former telecommunications complex outside Bonn that the German government officially considered a storage depot for decommissioned satellite hardware, which was accurate in the way that certain carefully worded statements are accurate, which is to say, accurately as far as the words went, and not any further. The drive from Cologne was 40 minutes in normal traffic. I made it in less than that. I was not in a regulatory frame of mind. The woman from the phone met me at the entrance. Her name was Admiral Lin Chen, 61 years old. Good posture in the way of someone who had learned to carry heavy things without letting the weight show in her spine. She was wearing the same gray blazer she had been wearing in Geneva 3 years ago, which either meant she had several of them, or she had very specific feelings about personal uniform. She did not drink coffee. I noted this on day 1, when I asked for some, and she looked at the coffee pot with the expression of someone who had once had a relationship with a thing, and had made the considered decision to end it. I filed it as data without context, which is where I put things when I expect the context to arrive eventually. She gave me a security clearance on the 2nd day that would normally take 10 years of institutional trust building and the kind of vetting that required people to speak to your primary school teachers. She handed it to me in a folder across a table and said, "We have needed someone who already knew what they were looking at." I did not say thank you. I asked for the files. The main briefing room was underground, temperature controlled to a degree that felt compensatory. 11 people arranged around a table, with the specific arrangement of people who had been sitting in the same positions long enough that the chairs had started to feel assigned. They were introduced to me by function: signals analyst, xenolinguist, theoretical physicist, strategic modeler, materials analyst, 2 people whose roles were described in terms vague enough to mean something specific that I was not yet cleared for. The strategic modeler was a man named Owen Briggs, about 35. He had a face that had not been young for a long time, not because of age but because of the kind of sustained knowing that ages from the inside. He was introduced as strategic modeling, which told me nothing particular, but his eyes found me the moment I sat down, and stayed there for a beat longer than professional assessment required. He was calculating something. I did not know yet what. I would find out. Admiral Chen stood at the front of the room and told me what the facility knew, and she did not soften it, which I respected, because I have never found softening useful, and I have never been able to perform gratitude for it convincingly. They had known for 11 years. 11 years. When Yara was 13 and had a poster of a radio telescope on her bedroom wall and was reading physics textbooks, she was technically 3 years too young for, and leaving them face down on the kitchen table, where I would find them and think, quietly, about what that meant for the kind of person she was becoming. 11 years of knowing, and the knowing had a name. The name was a construction, a phonetic approximation, assembled by the xenolinguistics team from signal data over many years. They called it the veil. It was probably not what they called themselves, if they had a name for themselves at all. It was the word the people in this room used when they needed to talk about the thing, and the word had become real through use, which is how all words become real. What the veil were: old. The theoretical physicist, a woman named Nadia who wore her hair short and had the distracted eyes of someone who was always partly inside a calculation, had spent time trying to express in conventional terms how old, and had eventually given up on conventional terms. The analogy she had settled on was that asking how old the veil were relative to humanity was approximately like asking a stone to describe the age of the mountain it was part of. They had been moving through the surveyed galaxy since before Earth had anything more complex than single-celled life. They had watched things born and stabilize and burn and collapse. They had, as far as 11 years of intelligence work could determine, encountered 43 intelligent spacefaring civilizations. Chen said that number the way you say something that has been sitting in your chest for so long, it has become part of your resting weight. 29 of the 43 had been absorbed. The briefing team had spent significant effort calibrating the precise meaning of absorbed, because precision mattered here, and because the alternatives were either too sterile or too dramatic. The most accurate description they had arrived at was this: those civilizations still existed, in the way a word exists inside a dictionary: present, preserved, capable of being referenced, not capable of producing anything new. 14 had been erased. The room held a silence after that word. Not the silence of people learning something terrible for the first time. The silence of people who have been carrying something terrible for a long time, and for whom saying it out loud is still a specific kind of work. I said, "What is the third category?" Chen looked at me. Steady. The posture of someone who had been asked this question before and had spent time preparing for the day she would have a new answer. She said, "In 43 encounters, there has been no third category." She paused. She said, "And then your daughter sent a signal from inside an event horizon." Every face in the room was on me. I said, "So my daughter is more diplomatically significant than 11 years of your work." The xenolinguist, a man named Peter with glasses, and the distracted energy of someone always slightly further into a thought than his words could keep up with, made a sound that was not agreement, but was not disagreement either. Owen Briggs, in his chair to my left, looked at his hands. Chen said, "The Veil do not communicate with the species they are processing. In 11 years and 43 datasets, there is no record of them reaching out to a target civilization. No warning. No acknowledgement that the target had a perspective worth addressing. The communication framework simply did not exist in their operational pattern." She said, "Until your daughter sent 3 words through an event horizon." She said, "Which means something made a choice that has no precedent in their entire observed history." I said, "Yes." She said, "We need to understand what that means." I said, "I already know what it means." The room shifted the way rooms shift when they were not expecting to be told something by the person who just arrived. I said, "She made them uncertain." I asked for a whiteboard. I got 3, and I started on all of them before the day was done. The files took 3 full weeks to understand at the depth I needed. The first pass took 4 days and gave me the geography. The second and third weeks gave me the terrain, which is different, which is the difference between knowing the shape of a country on a map and knowing what the ground feels like under your feet when you are standing in it. I had a cot in a room the facility called an office. It had a desk and a monitor array and a whiteboard that had not been cleaned since 48 hours after I arrived. The window showed the underside of a German winter sky that was operating at minimum ambition. It was useful as an orientation device. When the sky was visible, I knew which way was up, which mattered more than I expected in an underground facility where the lights did not change between day and night. Tomas arrived on day 6. He drove up from Cologne with my second laptop and a bag of coffee that actually tasted like coffee, unlike what the facility cafeteria was producing, which tasted like someone had described coffee to a person who had never had it, and they had done their sincere best. He arrived with the expression of a person who had run the calculations on what his supervisor had been doing for 6 days without contact, and had come to a conclusion he was prepared to act on without requiring an explanation first. He had his own whiteboard by day 8. He never asked me why we were there or what we were doing, not in those terms. He asked specific technical questions when he had them, and answered mine when I had them, and occasionally said, in a tone of pure intellectual delight, that I had come to regard as one of his better qualities. Things like that is not possible, which he invariably followed with a detailed explanation of what it was that was not possible, and how he intended to understand it anyway. He said that about the carrier wave encoding on day 4. He said, "This compression structure has no foundation in any mathematical framework I have studied or can locate in any published literature." I said, "Write that down." He wrote it down and continued working, which was the quality I valued most in him. The data on the 43 civilizations filled the kind of library that takes years to build and requires the specific dedication of people who know something enormous and cannot tell anyone, and have channeled all of that into documentation. I went through it the way I go through everything, systematically, and then a second time less systematically, and then I let it sit in my head for several days without looking at it directly, to see what the mind does with things when it thinks no one is watching. What it did was build a chart. Tomas built the mathematical framework for the visualization, which took 3 days and produced something that required 2 full whiteboards side by side, and that I stood in front of at various hours of the night, with the bad coffee and the good coffee alternately, and let my eyes move over, until the shape of it became something I understood, not just analytically, but in the way you understand something that has become part of your thinking. 29 absorbed civilizations. The common thread, when you looked across all 29, was adaptation. At some point during the Veil encounter, each of these civilizations had attempted to make itself legible, to study what the Veil were, to learn their communication structures and behavioral patterns, to respond in terms the Veil could recognize. It was the instinct of any intelligent species encountering something vastly older and more capable. You study it, you learn its language, you try to meet it where it lives, and show that you can be understood by it. Every single one of those 29 civilizations was absorbed. 14 erased civilizations. The common thread: unified, coordinated military response. The kind of defense that requires a civilization to agree fully on a single approach and execute it with the efficiency of a coherent whole moving in one direction, concentrated force, maximum coherence. Every single one of those 14 civilizations was erased. I stood in front of the chart at 2 in the morning on day 11, with the mediocre coffee, and I looked at the shape of the data, and I let myself think the thing I had been holding at the edge of thought for several days, without letting it fully in. When a pattern produces only 2 outcomes across 43 consecutive instances, there are 2 possibilities. Either the system is fundamentally deterministic, locked into those 2 outcomes by something structural that no variation in approach can change, or the third outcome exists, and no one has been positioned to produce it. The difference between those 2 possibilities was, in the most literal sense, everything. I pulled up Earth's file. The facility had one: our transmissions, our history from the first signals we put into space that something sufficiently distant and attentive could have received, our trajectory as a civilization across the period of Veil observation. I overlaid it on the chart of the 43. It did not look like any of them. Not because we had done anything special. The record of human civilization was not a record that produced simple pride on close examination. It was a record of remarkable capacities for both cruelty and generosity, frequently deployed simultaneously by different groups, with complete confidence in the righteousness of their respective positions. It was a record of 17 competing philosophies about what humanity was, and what it owed itself, and what it owed everything else, operating in parallel, producing contradictions at every scale, from personal to international. It looked like noise. Specifically, it looked like a system with too many variables operating at too many simultaneous scales for a single unified model to capture. The kind of system that modeling tools returned null results on, not because the system was empty, but because it was too full, too self-contradictory, too internally various to resolve into a stable description. I put the marker down. I looked at Tomas. He was looking at the chart. He had been looking at it in silence for some time, which for him was significant. He said, carefully, that we are impossible to model as a civilization. I said, yes. He said, that is not a strategic advantage. That is what happens when a species cannot achieve consensus on fundamental questions. I said, Name one predictive model that has ever successfully projected human collective behavior at the civilizational scale for longer than 6 months. He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to every question, the way you think about something when you actually intend to answer it. He said, "None." I said, 43 civilizations. Not one of them looked like that chart. Not one of them was too internally contradictory to categorize. Not one of them presented the veil with something that their modeling framework could not resolve into a clean category. I said, "The veil have been categorizing things for longer than our sun has existed. They have never encountered something they could not put in a box." I said, "They cannot put us in a box. And they have been trying for 2 months already." Tomas was quiet for a moment. He said, "How do you know they have been trying?" I said, "Because they sent a warning. Things that are certain do not warn. Things that are processing toward a known outcome, following a known procedure, operating from a framework that has succeeded 43 consecutive times, do not reach out to the thing they are processing. They do not need to. Uncertainty reaches out. Uncertainty, in something that has not been uncertain in any recorded encounter, is the most significant piece of information I had ever held." I picked up the marker. On the center whiteboard, below all the analysis, I wrote 2 questions. Why warn us? What did she find? I did not present the full theory for 2 more weeks. The evidence needed to be dense, tight, and unambiguous, because the room I was presenting to included people whose professional training had prepared them for many things, and had not prepared them for being told that the correct response to an existential threat was to continue being themselves, which was what I was essentially going to say. I needed the data to carry it. I also needed the second layer of the carrier wave, which Tomas and Claire and Patrick were working on in rotating shifts. The packet from Yara was structured in nested containers. The outer layer had held the map. What was beneath it remained locked behind an encoding that was a step more complex than anything in the outer layer, like a set of nested boxes where each inner box required a different key. Claire found the angle of approach on day 16. Patrick built the tool on days 17 and 18. Tomas refined it on day 19 and ran it overnight. And in the morning he came to my office with his laptop open and the expression of someone who has found what he was looking for and is still processing what it means. The second layer held a record. Not our intelligence on the veil. Their own record. Their own archive. Massive and structured and cross-referenced in the encoding they used for everything, covering their full history of encounters with the galaxy. The absorbed civilizations were in there. All 29. Their knowledge and discoveries and languages and frameworks and understanding of the universe, preserved the way a library preserves books, present, cataloged, accessible in theory, not being added to, everything they had ever taken. In a data packet sent from inside an event horizon by a 24-year-old signals officer who had been inside that system for 19 months and who had, apparently, spent those months working. I sat with that, not at the desk, in the chair by the window. The winter outside was gray and considered. A pigeon landed on the ledge and looked at me briefly and left, which felt, in the way of very tired minds at moments of overwhelming data, like a statement of some kind. I said to Tomas, "She was in there for 19 months. He said, "Yes." I said, "And she found the architecture." He said, "Yes." I said, "And she learned it well enough to build a traversal path out of it, and send it back to us using an encoding built from both human and veil frameworks that we could actually read." He said, "That is what the data says." The cold thing in my chest moved, found a new position, something shifting from one kind of weight into another kind, not lighter, but differently distributed, easier to carry. I said, "Call Owen." Tomas said, "Yes." I said, "And call Chen." He said, "Yes." I said, "I need an hour first." He left and closed the door, and I sat in the chair by the window and held the thing that was not grief anymore, and was not relief yet, but was something in between, that did not have a word. Then I picked up the marker and went to the whiteboards and started writing everything I was going to say. The Joint Command briefing was on day 26. 14 nations represented. The international coordination required to get those 14 sets of representatives into one room with sufficient shared information to make a joint session meaningful had involved, by Owen's count, over 800 encrypted communications, 3 near-catastrophic misunderstandings about scope, and 1 incident involving a simultaneous briefing of 2 delegations who did not know about each other, which had been resolved through the combination of quick thinking and deliberate vagueness that characterized most genuinely important decisions at the international level. The main briefing room was 3 times the size of the one I had started in. Better chairs, which I noted as a measure of how the facility's assessment of the situation had changed since I arrived with 3 encrypted drives and yesterday's jacket. I stood at the front. No slides, a whiteboard and a marker, and 37 faces looking at me with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have been waiting a long time for someone to tell them something that makes sense of everything they already knew. I said, "The Veil have a problem." The general in the back, whose name I had lost in the density of introductions and had not yet recovered, said with controlled precision, "We have a problem." I said, "Yes. But ours is temporary. Theirs is structural." I walked them through the chart. I had done this enough times in smaller rooms that the presentation had found its shape. I knew where to slow down, which was at the 2 categories and their outcomes. I knew where to go hard, which was at the implications. I knew which faces were going to go skeptical first, and where the pushback was going to come from, because there is always pushback, and the pushback is useful, and I had already thought through every version of it and had answers. I said, 43 civilizations. 2 outcomes, 29 absorbed, 14 erased. The absorbed ones adapted. The erased ones fought in a unified, coordinated way. Both approaches are logical. Both approaches are what any intelligent species would naturally do when encountering something vastly more powerful. And both approaches gave the Veil something they needed, which was a stable model. A civilization that adapts becomes legible through its adaptation. A civilization that fights becomes legible through the predictability of its tactics. In both cases, the Veil understood what they were dealing with, and once they understood, the outcome was consistent. I drew the Earth projection over the 43. I said, "We do not give them a stable model." Peter from Xenolinguistics said, from behind his glasses, "Be specific." I said, "In the period of Veil observation of our transmissions and behavior, every modeling framework our analytical team has been able to reconstruct from their signal patterns has failed to produce stable predictions for human collective behavior at the civilizational scale. We cooperate radically and then defect radically. We run contradictory strategies simultaneously at every level of organization and call it governance. We make decisions and then reverse them and make them again differently, and we call it progress. And sometimes it is and sometimes it is not, and there is no external pattern that predicts which is which. We produce extremes of care, and its opposite often by the same groups in the same era, and cannot fully explain either. A general near the front, a woman with the stillness of someone who had commanded large formations and understood the weight of orders, said, "That describes a dysfunction, not an advantage." I said, "It describes a dysfunction when measured against a framework that expects coherence. The Veil's framework expects coherence. Every civilization they have ever encountered has had enough internal coherence to resolve into a stable category. We are the first thing they have looked at that does not." I said, "They cannot absorb what they cannot categorize. The absorption process requires a stable model. They cannot erase what they cannot predict. The elimination process requires knowing where the target will be and what it will do. Against something that does not produce stable predictions, both of their standard processes break down." Owen said, from his seat to my left, quietly, "The warning." I looked at him. He said, "The warning did not come from generosity. It came because the thing they were processing did not behave like the other 43, and the way they tried to understand it was through the one human they had access to for 19 months. I said, "Yes." He said, "And it did not work." I said, "She kept being ours." The room was quiet, with the quiet of people sitting with something that was going to take time to carry. I said, "So here is what we do." I said it clearly, and I said it in enough detail that it became actionable, which took another hour and a half, and produced enough pushback from enough directions, that by the end of it, I was more confident the plan was real, because plans that produce no resistance are plans that nobody is actually thinking about. The general in the back said, "This is not a coherent defense posture." I said, "A coherent defense posture is something they can model. I am not describing a defense posture. I am describing a truth. The truth of what we actually are, which is 19,000 things simultaneously, which is the only version of us they cannot categorize, which is also the most accurate version of us that exists. I said, we do not perform this. We do not coordinate it. We simply do not compress ourselves into something that fits their framework. Another general said, and then what? After they observe us and cannot categorize us, then what? I said, then they go home to think about it. And while they are thinking, we use what my daughter gave us. I said, she spent 19 months inside their system, learning it from the inside. She built us a door. The archive is on the other side of it. Everything they have ever absorbed from every civilization they have encountered. 43 species worth of knowledge that none of those species' descendants will ever be able to access. I said, we will. The probe fleet arrived 4 months later. Not on a dramatic day. Not in response to any event or provocation. It simply appeared at the outer margin of our solar system one morning, while most of the northern hemisphere was eating breakfast, and the facility's detection network flagged it at 0400, and the joint command structure was fully operational by 0600, which was the fastest it had ever assembled, which was itself a form of information about how long everyone had been waiting. The fleet was smaller than projected. Owen's models had accounted for several possible fleet sizes and configurations, and this one was at the lower end of the range, which the xenolinguistics team spent most of day one debating. Peter said smaller meant more confident. They did not need to bring the full force, because they expected to categorize and act on a known timeline. Claire said smaller meant more uncertain. They were sending enough to observe thoroughly, but hedging against an outcome they could not fully predict. I said it did not matter which interpretation was right. The response was the same either way. The joint programs were already running when the fleet arrived. They had been running for months, because the preparations needed to be real, not performed, and real things took time to build. The decoy fleet was moving in patterns that Owen had designed, with the specific goal of being technically coherent as a defensive formation, while actually emerging from 17 separate sets of orders, written by 17 separate teams, who had been given slightly different briefs, which was not how any military operation had ever been run in the history of military operations, and which produced something that looked, from the outside, like deliberate strategy, but was actually the output of a process that could not be reverse-engineered into a single model. This was the point. Adese's broadcast program had been running for 2 months. She was a composer from Ottawa who had been consulting on signal frequency analysis and had looked up from a spectral chart one afternoon and said, we should be transmitting everything, not a curated collection, not the version of ourselves we would select to present to something we were trying to impress. Everything. 40,000 years of argument and music and contradicting ourselves and building things and tearing them down and building them differently. The contradictions especially. The places where we disagreed most loudly with ourselves about what we were. The generals had not been immediately enthusiastic. Adese had said, you want something impossible to categorize? Show them the full record of what humans do when they are not performing. The broadcast ran on 16 simultaneous frequencies, covering a content range that included everything from parliamentary debates to competitive baking to arguments between schools of philosophy that had been running for centuries without resolution, to music that was in direct conversation with other music and disagreed with it, and both were right in different ways. The probe fleet observed for 11 days. Claire's signal team tracked the scan patterns around the clock. On day 8, she came to find me in the monitoring room at 3 in the morning and said, the scan pattern has changed from what we projected based on the 43 encounter data. I said, how? She said, slower, more granular. They are not scanning us the way they scanned civilizations they were moving toward a decision about on a known timeline. They are scanning us the way you scan something when the first scan did not return what you expected, and you are looking more carefully for the thing you thought would be there. I said, good. She went back to her station, and I stood in the monitoring room and looked at the feeds and did not feel what I had expected to feel, which was fear. What I felt was something older than the situation called for, something that had been in my chest for 19 months and had been cold and had moved twice and had now arrived at something that was not calm, exactly, but was its functional equivalent. On day 11, at 0730 in the morning, the probe fleet left. Not dramatically, not with any signal or transmission or gesture toward the species it had been observing. It stopped being present in our outer system the way lights stop when someone turns off the switch, comprehensively, without a process, all at once. The main briefing room was chaos in 6 languages. People who had been operating at high sustained tension for months releasing it all at once, which is loud and sometimes tearful and entirely understandable. Owen sat down in a chair and looked at his hands with the expression of a man whose model had just produced the result he had built it to produce, and who was not entirely sure how to receive that. I sat at the back. I did not erupt. I had known for 2 days that this was the likely outcome. I had been sitting with it for 2 days, feeling its shape, finding where it fit in the larger picture that was not finished, and would not be finished for a long time. The celebration was real. I did not want to diminish it. The probe fleet leaving had never happened before in 43 encounters. Its significance was genuine. But it was not an ending. I want to be clear about that. An ending would mean they were gone. What it meant was that something very old and very certain had encountered something it could not categorize, and it had done what very old and very certain things do when that happens, which was to withdraw and reconsider. They would come back with a different approach. Possibly a better question. Possibly the 19 months they had spent in proximity to Yara, translated into some new analytical framework that we had not yet imagined. They were patient in the way of things that measured time in spans that made the word patience sound provincial. We had bought ourselves time. What we did with it was what mattered. Owen found me at the back of the room and handed me a cup of the bad coffee, in the gesture of someone who understood what you hand a person who needs something to hold. He said, "How long do you think?" I said, "Long enough if we use it. Not long enough to be comfortable." He said, "What does using it look like?" I said, "Going through the door my daughter built. Everything in that archive. Every absorbed civilization's knowledge, every discovery that was taken from species that are now preserved in a dictionary, without readers. All of it sitting on the other side of a traversal path that Yara built from the inside, with no guarantee it would ever be used." Owen was quiet for a moment. He said, "She sounds extraordinary." I said, "She lost her flashcards before every exam, and passed anyway. She was the kind of person who prepared thoroughly, and then trusted herself more than the preparation." He said nothing, because there was nothing useful to add, and he was smart enough to know it. 3 weeks after the probe fleet withdrew, at 4:47 in the morning, the deep array station pinged. My station. The one outside Cologne that Hollenbeck's committee had nearly defunded 3 times, and that I had kept running through every review cycle, for reasons I had told no one, including myself in clear language. The one that cost a number I could not repeat in polite company, and that had been, for 19 months, the last thing I was willing to give up. I was awake. I had developed a specific and unexamined relationship with 4:47 a.m. over the preceding months, and I was sitting at the desk when the ping came, with coffee that was actually warm, which felt like a development. No voice this time. A data packet. New encoding, different from the veil encoding in the first signal, different from human standard, something built from both the way a new language gets built by someone who has grown up inside two, and has started to think in the space between them. I called Tomas. He answered immediately. I said, "The station pinged." He was in his car in 40 minutes and in my apartment in 47, which was not a speed I was going to comment on, and he set up on the second desk and started running decoding tools before he had taken his coat off. He cracked it in 4 hours. 4 hours during which I made coffee, and drank it, and made more, and stood at the window, and watched the Cologne winter dark make its slow decision about whether to become morning. The pigeons on the opposite roof were doing whatever pigeons did at 5 in the morning, which appeared to involve standing very still and thinking things over, which I respected. At 8:53 in the morning, Tomas turned his laptop to face me without saying anything. Inside the packet was a map, not of something approaching, of a path going the other direction. A traversal route through the interior of the Veil network. Not external intelligence, not an approach from outside. A path built from inside, by someone who had spent 19 months learning the architecture of a system designed to absorb and categorize, and had instead learned where the seams were, where the connections ran, how the structure was organized at every level from the outermost to the deepest. A path that led through the full archive, through the absorbed knowledge of 43 civilizations, through the preserved record of everything the Veil had ever encountered and taken and cataloged and stored, everything that the descendants of those 43 species would never be able to access, because the Veil had not seen the point of returning it. We could access it, if the path was real, if it held, if the encoding translated across the distance, and the physics, and everything else that stood between my apartment in Cologne and an event horizon 4,000 light-years away. My daughter had built it. From the inside. Over 19 months, with no way of knowing if it would ever be received, no way of knowing if the station was still running, no way of knowing if the encoding she was constructing from 2 frameworks, neither of which had been designed for this purpose, would translate into anything a human mind could follow. She had built it anyway, because she knew the station was running, because she knew me, because she had known since she was 9 years old, standing on the roof of my university building, with her mittens on, and her neck craned back, and her mouth open at the sky, that I did not put things down, that I kept the agreement, that I would be at the desk at 4:47 in the morning, waiting, because the alternative was not something I was capable of. She kept being yours. I sat down. Not at the desk, in the chair by the window. The winter outside was doing what it did, which was be pale and considered. A tram went past on the street below, orange and ordinary and entirely itself. The pigeons on the opposite roof were still thinking things over. I sat in that chair for a while with everything that had been in my chest for 19 months, and I let it find its new shape. And I did not rush it, and I did not name it, because some things do not need names. They need time. Then I stood up and called Chen. She answered on the first ring. I said, "The station pinged. She sent us the path. The archive is accessible. I need a team and I need access to the array's full capacity, and I need Owen and Claire and Tomas and I need to start today." Chen said, "We have been ready for 2 weeks." I said, "Then let us go." I hung up and looked at Tomas. He was already pulling on his coat. I picked up the phone one more time. Darnell answered on the second ring. Austin was 6 hours behind. Early morning there. The particular stillness before a Texas day decided what it was going to be. He answered on the second ring because he was awake, or had not been to sleep, or had been sitting in a chair in his own kitchen, in his own version of this long, patient wait we had both been running for 19 months without comparing notes. He answered and did not say anything. He just answered. I said, "She is okay." Not that she was coming home. I did not know that yet, and I was not in the business of saying things I could not stand behind. Not that she was alive, because I did not know yet what that word meant in the context of where she was and what she had become, and I was not ready to apply it until I understood the shape of the answer. Not anything that promised what I could not yet promise. "She is okay." He made a sound. I do not have a word for the sound. I had not heard it in 3 years, and had not known I was listening for it until it came through the phone at 8:59 in the morning, while Tomas was putting his coat on behind me, and the tram went past again outside, and the winter made its slow decision about the day. I let the sound sit between us. I did not fill it with words. Some things are more themselves without words around them. I said, "I have to go. I will call you Sunday." He said, "Yes." He said, "Mara." I said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you." I said, "Thank her." I hung up and turned back to the desk and the laptop and the packet and the path, and the archive at the end of it, and the 43 civilizations whose knowledge was sitting in the dark waiting for someone to come through the door that my daughter had built from the inside over 19 months, in the most isolated place the universe had to offer. The door was open. The sky outside my window made its decision, and became morning. I picked up the marker. I started writing.